Come, we have a place for you. Rudrick gestured toward a waist-high twist of root to the left of his throne. Nia led Lily, Janner, Oscar, Artham, and Podo through the multitude to the tree. Janner could feel every eye in the room watching, as he was self-conscious of the way he walked, the way he held his mouth, and how filthy his clothes were. He wanted to exude the same quiet strength as his mother, but he was pretty sure he exuded nothing but awkwardness. They approached the root, and Rudrick motioned for them to sit. Beside him were the chiefs, 4 men and 3 women, seated in smaller chairs. Each of the chiefs had a dog, either curled at the foot of the chair or leaning against it. Rudrick's dog sat at attention beside his throne, and looked big enough to swallow the others. Each woman's hair and each man's beard was adorned with a single jeweled braid that matched one of Rudrick's 7 braids. They frowned as the wing feathers sat at on the root bench. "I've been the keeper of the Hollows for 5 years," Rudrick began. "You fled Anira 9 years ago. It was years before that since we had set foot in your land." "Yes, Keeper, it's been a long time. I've gathered the council today in order to hear your case, but also to help you understand why things happened on your ship the way they did. I've no wish to offend the Queen of the Shining Isle." He waited for Nia to answer, but she only lifted her chin and listened. "When Nag the Nameless and his fangs overran your kingdom, we heard rumors, but we didn't believe them for days. We smelled the smoke a full day before we saw it. I was in the company that sailed to Anira to give aid where we could, but—" Rudrick cleared his throat. "But the whole city was burning. Flames scorched the sky. We brought back as many survivors as we could, but they didn't number enough to fill a single ship. It was terrible. I saw fangs dancing in the fire and trolls everywhere. I saw other creatures too." He lowered his voice. "Long-legged things, skittering things, things that lumbered and wailed and leapt over burning houses." Lily leaned her head on Podo's arm and squeezed her eyes shut. Janner looked over the council and saw men and women with ashen faces remembering the terrors of days past. "We fled," Rudrick continued. "Anira was a ruin, and we feared the Green Hollows would be next. So we boarded ship and sailed ahead of the smoke with Fang ships in our wake. The watchers at the water crawl weren't prepared for a fleet of Fang ships, and couldn't get the gate raised in time. The Fangs followed us right into the harbor, thousands of them. Men and women and children armed themselves and fought from the piers. We put out fire after fire, launched stone after stone, and when the Fangs leapt overboard and slithered through the sea, when they crawled out of the water like a plague, we fought them with swords and hammers and bows and spears. We fought with our hands. Many men died, Nia, more than you would believe. Your family in Ban Rugan, Malik and the rest of the Igby clan, the Borman clan, Yarly Craw and his 5 daughters, your aunts and uncles, your cousins, Nia, all dead." Nia's eyes closed. She sat straight and still, but Janner could tell Rudrick's words stung her. "It was a terrible time. For 9 years Fangs had plagued our waters. 6 times they attacked in force. A whole fleet of ships tried to break through the water crawl and failed. Again and again we drove them back. They dared not come through the Black Wood, though over the years even the Cloven had grown bolder. Lands that were once safe for shepherders and grazers are now in danger of twisted things that rove the forests and its edges." Rudrick paused again to see if Nia had anything to say. She didn't. All these years our northern borders were untroubled. The Fangs were vulnerable to the cold. We saw the way they dragged and cowered when the icy wind blew, and how they never let skirmishers from the northern hills. We were safe for a long time, but last year something changed. A new thing came to the Hollows. Rudrick motioned to someone on the far side of the hall. and two massive doors swung open. Two men entered, rolling a cage on a wooden cart. In the cage was a ragged, broken thing. Its snout was longer than the gray fangs Janner had seen at the Battle of Chimera. Those gray fangs had seemed intelligent, more so than the snake-like ones. But this creature snarled and rattled the bars of the cage with beastly strength. Even from the other side of the hall, Janner could see that its eyes were blank with madness, devoid of anything human. It swung its head about, throwing a hungry, unthinking gaze at everything it saw. Its snout was curled in a permanent snarl, revealing long, needle-like teeth, and a dry black tongue lolled out of the side of its mouth, like a dead fish. Its fur had been torn out in patches, revealing sickly pink skin. When it saw the array of Hollows folk, its thrashing intensified. It arched its back and loosed a papery shriek. That was the closest thing to a howl the wretch could manage. Its black eyes roved the room, and Janner was terrified that its eyes would linger on him, as if they were empty wells into which he might fall forever. Janner would have grabbed Lili and run, had Rudrick not been so calm. "This," the keeper said, "is the only shadow of the thing we captured. Its name was Nuzzard, and it spoke quite well when our scouts at the Kola orchard caught it. It was part of a company of Grey Fangs sent to test our borders for weaknesses. The others died. You know what happens when they die." Nia nodded. They turned to dust. "We're no strangers to fangs, Rudrick." "Good. Then you know that what happens to them over time." Nia hesitated. Janner thought about the Grey Fangs in the Iramir's brig. They had grown more and more violent by the day. But what happened to them after they had set adrift, no one knew. They had probably died, but as Poto said, that was in the hands of the Maker. Nia looked at the sniveling monster in the cage and shuddered. "This, I suppose, the Grey Fangs are dangerous enough in their ordinary form, but if it can be called that. But what they become is even worse." Rudrick crossed the room and stood before the cage. The creature shook the bars and howled its papery howl. "They become the stuff of scary tales. I hate to imagine what would happen if this thing were loose in the Hollows." Rudrick nodded at the guards, and they rolled the wagon away. "So you see, your highness, we cannot let a fang loose in the land." Nia stood and clenched her fists at her side. "You may speak," Rudrick said. Janner wasn't sure, but he thought he saw beneath his bushy beard a gulp. Nia spoke through her teeth. "I come to you not only as the Queen of Anira, but as the daughter of the Hollows. I grew up here in Banrana. My grandfather, Kargan Igby, was himself the keeper for 2 seasons. I see gathered here ambassadors from Banhin, Banrugan, Banyorna, and all the villages between men and women who knew me when I was young, who have known the Igby family for an epoch. I love this land, as you do, and would not put it in danger." Janner noticed Rudrick steal a glance at the assembly, and like a flicker of light, a smile flashed at the brush of his beard. Janner couldn't make sense of it at first, but when he saw the faces of the Hollows folks gathered in the hall, he understood. They were attentive now, and they had been angry the night before. Rudrick had readied them to listen. Nia took a deep breath, turned to the assembly, who sat under the tree like children at story time, and spoke. "The Queen's tail and the Warden's wings. The Fangs attacked Castle Ryzen more swiftly than we could have imagined," Nia spoke quietly, but her voice carried through the leafy hall. "Esben, the children, and I were together in the dining hall one moment, and the next it seemed the whole world had grown scales and fangs. They poured into the castle. We ran. Esben never made it out of the castle. Mother was killed." Poto sucked in his breath and stared at the floor, because that was his wife. Janner heard several sniffles in the room and wondered how many of the assembly had known Wendelin Helmer. By the Maker's hand we crossed the dark sea of darkness, where we've hidden these many years in a little town called Glipwood, where my father grew up. The Fangs had no idea who we were until this summer. One of them recognized the Aneurin crest on one of my necklaces, and they would have shipped us to Nag himself if we hadn't had help. She looked at Artham, and all eyes in the room followed her gaze. She sat under the drape of canvas with her head bowed. He sat under the drape of canvas with his head bowed. Janner saw his cheek twitch, and one of the hidden wings stirred. Artham P. Wingfeather, Throne Warden of Anera, found us. He'd kept watch over the jewels for years, so when the Fangs captured us, he came to our rescue. Nia smiled at him, but we looked away. The Throne Warden was true to his vow to protect the High King. Not even the dark sea could keep him from us. Artham's cheeks splotched with either embarrassment or nervousness. Then he made a tiny whimpering sound, quiet enough that Janner wasn't sure the assembly heard it. It was odd to see flickers of Pete the Sockman, after so many days of Artham behaving as he must have been before the Great War. Before something had happened to him, something that had left him with a shock of white hair and hideous claws, and his hide under a pair of knitted socks. In the Foob Islands, something more had happened. It was something Janner still didn't understand. Even as Kalmar had transformed into a Grey Fang, Artham had changed from a crazy man with claws to an elegant winged warrior. His unwieldy talons had refined into rust-colored hands and slender, graceful claws. He had become not less, but more, and the gibberish was placed by a strong voice and eloquent speech. Artham was a poet after all, but just as there had been glimpses of the real Artham hidden in Pete the Sockman, now Janner caught a glimpse of Pete the Sockman in the real Artham. It was troubling. We escaped, Nia said, releasing Artham from her gaze, on the way to the ice prairies, where we thought we might find refuge. Janner and Kalmar were separated from us. Then they were separated from each other. Janner braved much evil to escape Dugtown, and eventually made his way to Chimera, a secret city in the snow. But Kalmar, Nia's voice cracked, Kalmar lost his way. The statement deepened the silence of the room. Even the great tree seemed to listen. He was captured by stranders, men and women with black hearts, sold to the Fangs, and in the dungeon he... Janner knew the story, but he could hardly bear to hear it told. He tried to imagine what it would be like to tell a room full of strangers about his darkest moments. He was glad Kalmar wasn't there to hear it. He became a Fang, Thea said. Many in the crowd murmured to one another and shook their heads. Nag has learned to change people. He's learned to take the essence of a snake and meld it with a man or woman to create something horrible. That's why there are Fangs, Grey Fangs. Kalmar was captured by the Fang Makers. The assembly hissed with hatred. The man called Bungie stepped out of the crowd and shouted, "I knew it! It's a beast, and there's no undoing it. Kill the Fang, like we have all the others. If it's not human, it's not welcome." Artham flung off his canvas, unfurled his wings. "Hollows folk," he cried, "behold the Maker's good pleasure." The assembly gasped. I was broken, I tell you, hardly a man at all. Unmade and floundering was I, but in the pit of the Foobs I too sang the song of the stones. I became no Fang, but sprouted these. He flexed his wings and swooped them forward, blowing back the hair of those nearest him. I cannot tell you why. All I know that it is my heart was a burning love for young Kalmar. Nag Ben's Nag bends things for breaking, and the maker makes a flourish. Evil digs a pit, and the maker makes a well. That is his way. Warden Wingfeather, we hear your words, Rudrick said, stroking his beard. We see your wings, and indeed we are suspicious of you, as of the young Fang in the dungeon. If I believe it were possible to bind you, I would. The Hollows folk murmured their agreement. You are neither animal nor man, unnaturally transformed. How does this come to be if not by some black power? Janner saw on his mother's face that even she wanted to know the answer to this question. Poto's and Oscar's bushy gray eyebrows were raised thoughtfully as they watched Artham for his reaction. The birdman's wings ruffled and folded. Arham pursed his lips and nodded his head. The mystery runs deeper than my understanding, but I'll tell you what I believe. Artham locked his fingers behind his back, looked over the faces of the assembly, cleared his throat. When the Fangs took Castle Ryzen, my brother Esben, Artham swallowed. He took a deep breath and began again. When the Fangs took the castle, my brother Esben, Janner saw beads of sweat form on his uncle's brow. Esben neighed he seeded something. Said he needed something. Said he needed something. Thing. From inside. Said he would bum cack. Artham, closing his eyes and clenched his jaw, he twitched his head. Whispers fluttered like moths among the Hollows folk. The blood ran from Janner's face as he watched Artham sink below the surface while Pete the sock man rose. Artham opened his eyes long enough to look at Janner with a childlike panic that stabbed the boy's heart. I'm sorry, Artham whispered. Janner couldn't tell if he was speaking to him or to everyone. I'm so sorry, he repeated, and the old Pete's shrill voice played at the edges of his words. He closed his eyes again, crouched and sprang into the air. He flapped his great wings and circled the tree a few times before lighting on a high branch. Janner saw in his uncle's wheeling eyes not just the madness of Pete the Sockman, but the frustration and grief of Artham P. Wingfeather, the throne warden who couldn't stop what was happening. As beautiful and strong as Artham had become, something still haunted him, something that lurked like a sea dragon in his deep waters, and had slain and laid silent for weeks, choosing this of all moments to rise to the surface. Rudrick seized his warhammer from beside the throne. The Hollows folk were a tumult of angry shouts, cries of alarm and shaking fists. Nia and Poto shouted for them to lower their weapons. Oscar waved at the people and said, "In the words of Goverly Swimp, there's no need to panic." "We have to stop them," Lily said. "They'll kill him." She pointed across the room at a group of men stringing bows and fishing arrows from a barrel. Before we realized what he was doing, Janner ducked from behind Rudrick, climbed up the back of his throne, jumped from the lowest branch of the tree. As soon as he caught the branch, all the hours he'd spent climbing Glipwood oaks, swinging from mossy limb to mossy limb, scooting to get after Calmar, either to catch him or to keep him from hurting himself, suddenly felt like practice for this single moment. He climbed the tree as lithe as a thwap, swinging under limbs, scooting along others, closer every moment to the upper corner of the chamber, where Pete trembled and twitched like a trapped bird, his talons flexing, his wings flipping madly. Artham was terrified, and he was terrifying. Janner edged along a branch of the tree as thick as his waist, calling Artham's name again and again. But if Artham heard, he showed no sign. The men with bows had nocked arrows and trained them on Artham, waiting for either a signal from Rudrick or a movement from the Birdman. Janner was sure Artham would could defeat every warrior in the room if he wanted, but these were old allies, kinsmen, people acting not out of evil but out of fear. There must have been enough of Artham's sanity left to restrain his fury, but they didn't. But why didn't he flee? The main doors of the hall were flung wide open, and it would be an easy thing for him to fly through and away to safety. Janner had started climbing the tree with the idea in his head, but now that the floor was so far below, he wondered what he'd been thinking. "Uncle Artham!" he cried again, but Artham only shook his head and googled his eyes everywhere except at Janner, whimpering to himself in nonsensical words. If Janner was going to act, he had to do it now. The archers were hungry for a reason to shoot. Rudrick was shouting. Oscar was waving his hands, and Nia's head was buried in Poto's shoulder. Only Lily saw Janner in the tree. Their eyes met. She smiled at him, and Janner said, "Uncle Artham." "Uncle Artham. Artham. Uncle Artham." I don't know how to say it. My wife tells me I say it wrong. "Uncle Artham. Artham. Help!" Then he jumped. Yikes. And then he jumped. Alright, so we have not figured out what's going to happen to Tink. Let's wait till this loads. We don't know what's going to happen to Tink, but we do know that Janner is jumped off of the top of the tree, and he's really hoping Artham will save him, but we'll see. So now we're on to the next chapter. The next chapter.